Hello, everyone. This is your lecture for Geoffrey Chaucer's Wife of Bath's prologue. So we have 2 weeks that we're spending with the Wife of Bath, one with the prologue and one with the tale that she tells, which connects the prologue in a few interesting ways. The Wife of Bath, as I mentioned in the Übungen, is an odd character because she essentially escapes the text that she's created in and gains a life of her own. And since her appearance in the Canterbury Tales in the late 14th century, the last decade of the 14th century, she has starred in a number of other works. I'll just give you a quick overview of some before we get into the prologue. So on June 25, 1600, two London printers, Edward Aldie and William White, were fined 5 shillings each for printing a disorderly ballad of the Wife of Bath. William's brother, Edward White, was fined 10 shillings for his offense and disorder in selling it. Seems a bit odd that a tale about the Wife of Bath would lead to a fine. But in fact, 32 years later, in 1632, the printer Henry Goskin was sent to prison for publishing this ballad, which didn't keep other people from publishing it. It was printed in several versions over 54 times and was included in up to multiple anthologies up to the 19th century. So here's one example of this ballad, which basically has the Wife of Bath knock on heaven's gate, and she's refused admission to heaven because she's a sinner. Adam is the one who says no to her. She points out that he's the cause of all human misery, and he runs away. And then a whole bunch of other biblical figures from both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament come up and try to tell her in various ways to go to hell. So Jacob, Lot, Judith, Solomon, Mary Magdalene, the apostles Paul and Peter. But she has a retort ready for each of them and confronts them with their own infractions. So she notes that Solomon was convinced by his wives to forsake the Lord, Lot slept with his daughters, and so on. She softens up a bit when Christ shows up, and then she asks for mercy. But even then, she can be pushy even with Christ. So when he hesitates to accept her confession, she notes that the loving father did his prodigal son forgive. And then Christ, browbeaten into submission by the Wife of Bath, relents and allows her to enter heaven. So you can see why this is, there are religious reasons why this was problematic in the early 17th century, but it's also the Wife of Bath taking on the entire structure of authority of the Christian faith in this very popular form. Since her appearance in the Canterbury Tales, this clothmaker, serial wife, hobby exegete, and passionate pilgrim has made appearances in a host of works. So she was the subject of a play by John Gay in 1713, The Wife of Bath. You see the cover of the printed play. Her tale was retold by Voltaire and by John Dryden. I've given you John Dryden's version. He just does the tale, not the prologue. And then she's also served as the inspiration for a number of works. There's Susan Swan's 1999 novel, The Wives of Bath, which is set in a fictitious Toronto private school. A private school for girls called the Bath Ladies College. And there's a bit of naughtiness in that one. It was made into a movie. Jean Binta Breeze found her in Brixton Market in her 2000 poetry collection, The Arrival of Bright Eye. And she also appears as the femme fatale Mrs. Alice Ebibafa from Nigeria in Patience Apgabi's Telling Tales. This was a 2014 book that was a kind of reimagined version of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. And there's been a bit of a Wife of Bath boom in recent years. I've just picked out 3 covers for you. There's the 2019 experimental work, Alison Sings by Caroline Bergvall, in which Bergvall has Alison serve as a kind of conduit for feminist voices throughout the centuries. Zadie Smith wrote a play based on the Wife of Bath called The Wife of Willesden, in which Alison becomes Alvida, a Jamaican-British middle-aged woman who criticizes society, perfectionism, judgmentalism, social media, all kinds of things. And then quite odd and interesting is a young adult novel by Karen Brooks from 2021 called The Good Wife of Bath, in which Allison is a very business-minded entrepreneur, very girl boss kind of figure who, due to an evil husband, winds up running a bordello south of London. So I guess, one of the questions I've had all along, and you might have your own answers to, as you think about her, is why she's so popular, why she has such a life of her own. What gives her, I mean, we don't have this with any other character in the Canterbury Tales, right? That they have this kind of a career post-work. So just to give you an introduction, we have a very lively portrait of her in the prologue to the Canterbury Tales, which again, I did not assign you, but I'm pulling out a few details from it here. A good weef was there of beside Bath, but she was somdel deaf, and that was scath. Of cloth making, she had a switch and haunt, she passed him of Ypres and of Gaunt. So she's described as deaf. It's almost the first detail we have about her. And we get her career, what she does for work here. She is a cloth maker. During this period, the best cloth was made in Belgium, so Ypres and Ghent, but the English wool industry was on the rise. And she seems to be a very successful businesswoman. The prologue describes her clothing. She wears these elaborate headdresses, scarlet hose. She's very confident. It's all kind of interesting because these are details that she doesn't necessarily talk about in her prologue or in her story. The cloth making is not there. In her prologue, she represents herself as a serial wife and making her money that way. But in the prologue to the Canterbury Tales, we know that she's actually quite a successful businesswoman. And also in the prologue, we learn that she has had 5 husbands at the church door, which is where people got married in the Middle Ages, not inside the church. I'll just read the passage out. She was a worthy woman all her life, whose bondes at church door she had a fieve, without an other company in youth. But thereof needeth not to speak as note. And thrice had she been at Jerusalem, she had passed many a strong stream. At Rome she had been, and at Bologna. In Gallis at Saint James and at Cologne. She could muchel of wandering be the way. So there are a few things that are hard to explain or sort of gloss about this passage. The line without an other company in youth, is it meant to say that she had no other company in youth? I'm not sure what youth would be left to her given that she started marrying at age 12. Or, I think it probably means not counting the other companies that she had in youth, as in she might have had affairs outside of her husband's as well. And the reason I think that is because of the next line, which is to say, let's not talk about that. let's not dwell on that topic. We also get the sense that she's a pilgrim. This is not unusual for the time. The pilgrimage is big business, and it is a major form of spiritual activity, but also entertainment in the late Middle Ages. Lots of people go on pilgrimage. Some of them go for God, and some of them really go for fun or to see new things or hear new stories, or essentially it's the medieval form of tourism. And there are all kinds of anxieties in the Middle Ages as well about women who are pilgrims, right? Because they will be in danger of being sexually assaulted, because they might wind up as prostitutes, because they might see the world. There's a feeling that while it's all right that men be pilgrims, women should probably stay home and just imagine themselves on pilgrimage. Alison of Bath is clearly one of the people who goes out. She goes out and travels. She wanders a lot. I think this line, she could muchel of wandering be the way. She knows about wandering around. She knows about traveling. She knows about experience. She gathers experience of her own. And that experience gives her her own point of view. And it's actually, it's quite interesting to see that when she starts her prologue, the very first word in her speech is experience. Experience durch non autorité were in this world, were richt enoch to me, to speak of what that is in marriage. For lording as sith I 12 year was of age, I thank it be God that is eternal on leave, whose bondes at church door I have had five. So she begins to say, look, she contrasts her own experience with authority, and we're going to talk in a moment about authority and what that means. But she's basically saying, even if there were no authority in the world, I would be able to speak of the woe that is in marriage, because I have had these 5 marriages. I've had 5 husbands. It's an odd line because she claims she will speak about woe in marriage, and yet then the first thing she does is defend marriage. But that's just one of the many ways that she's slippery, and she doesn't really, she's not a character that you can pin down to one position in a really concrete and coherent way. So what is autorité? That's one of these words that in Middle English maybe has, I guess it's complex in modern English as well, but it's used a lot in Middle English, especially in literary contexts. So it's legal power, right? A position of authority, an official position, as today. The power to convince or influence people. These are from the Middle English Dictionary, by the way. It's authorization or official sanction, legal validity, recognized worth. So these are all, I think, senses that are also present in modern English. But maybe a meaning which is very common in the Middle Ages and less common today is an authoritative passage or statement, a passage quoted to prove or support a proposition, a text of scripture, or an authoritative book or writing, an authoritative doctrine as opposed to reason or experience, an author whose opinions or statements are regarded as correct. And medieval authors, to some extent, many medieval authors are obsessed with autorité, with authority, with the book or passage that considers right, that would be proof of what you were arguing. And the sense of authorship in the Middle Ages is that you gain authority by basing your work on other authorities. In a sense, it still works that way in academic writing, right? You don't just come up with your own idea and say, look, here's my brilliant idea. It might be brilliant, but it's based on no one else. How we get our authority when we write an academic, a research paper or a term paper is by gathering up authorities from the past who say something similar, and then maybe we represent them correctly and build on them. Maybe sometimes we change it around a little bit. But that's how we get our own authority, by gathering up other authorities, as in authors and texts that seem to say something like what we believe in. And when the wife of Bath is talking about autorité, authority, she means the texts. I think she also means an entire system of authority, which is university educated, highly literate, and male dominated. Not just male dominated, but exclusively populated by men. There aren't women students at university at this time, and there aren't women clerks in the church or anything like that. So she is talking about textual history, but also a history of masculine power and the power that's derived from texts. And part of what she's doing is saying, my experience, all of these male authors have written about marriage, and this was in a moment also virginity, but my experience is just as valid. I also get to talk about these things too. I can, in a sense, preach, which is what she does. I can teach people about marriage because I've married 5 husbands, and that's as good as anyone else. It's as good as any of these books can provide. And the particular thing that she is interested in arguing against is a powerful cultural value in the Middle Ages, namely the idealization of virginity, especially for women. the idea that you find in Paul really applied to both men and women. And then in St. Jerome, who, again, also for men and women, but especially for women, the idea is that the good Christian will stay a virgin and will try to stay a virgin not only in body, but also in mind, right? We'll try to not feel lust. And if you marry, if you have desires that are so powerful that they would cause you to do something sinful, then you can go ahead and get married rather than going to hell. It's preferable that you get married and have legitimate sex within marriage than that you go have sex with everybody you want in various sinful ways. So that's Paul. Jerome is very interested in virginity for women. This is why a lot of the saints, there's Barbara on the left. I have to look up the other two, but a lot of these saints are tortured in order to preserve their virginity. The female saints, it's not usually the male saints who are tortured to preserve their virginity. The classic late antique saint's life is, a sort of foaming at the mouth, grotesque pagan emperor or governor sees a beautiful 15-year-old Christian virgin and wants her as his lover. She says no. He then offers to make her his concubine or wife, empress, etc. She says, well, no, I'm married to a better man, Christ, and he's the king of the world, so I'm already essentially a queen or an empress. And then these women are graphically tortured and eventually executed, and they feel no pain, even as horrific things are done with them. I think you can see from the medieval images that there's a sort of prurient aspect to consuming these stories and these images, right? It has to do with the image of these young women being violated, essentially, or potentially being violated. But these are pictures that would have been in churches. They would have, somebody in Chaucer's time would have heard these stories in all kinds of contexts. And it is clear that this is perfection, right? Especially for women, this is how to achieve perfection. And there's a very clear hierarchy of women. Virgins are at the top. I think chaste widows after that. So ideally, if you had to get married, but then you've been widowed, you should not marry again. You should then stay chaste. And so you're sort of done with your sexual life. Then married women, and then women who are sexually loose are at the very bottom. When a woman in the Middle Ages marries a number of times, when she's repeatedly widowed and repeatedly marries, the more moralistic writers will see that as a sign of her lust. So, in fact, it was done quite often, and Marion Turner has a book on the wife of Bath where she talks about how Chaucer's granddaughter actually married multiple times and sort of got a better and better, richer and better placed husband each time. So she really went up in the world through a series of marriages and gathered both wealth and social status. So this is actually what women did at this time. And it wasn't just for lust. It was also for security. It was for property. It might have been for children. There were, probably more pragmatic reasons than lust. But from the moralistic point of view, it's described as being something that lusty women do because they just can't get enough sex, right? So they marry over and over again. So the wife of Bath, in that sense, is a bit of a stereotype. Nevertheless, she in the first part of her prologue, she decides to argue against virginity and in favor of the married life. And she knows that her whole culture agrees that virginity is perfection. That is the best way to be. And yet she tries all kinds of arguments for it. I'm not going to cover them all. I'm just going to do a little sprinkling to give you a flavor of it. But you could go through the prologue and see all of the different arguments. So one of them is, quite simply, that God told people to have children. Men my devin and glosen up aan doen. but well I would express with utterly, God bade us for to wax and multiply. That gentle text can I understand. So what is she saying? She presents herself as an interpreter of the Bible, and she's saying God bade us to wax, to multiply, to go forth and multiply. Um, this is Genesis, of course. And she's saying, look, even though I'm a woman, I mean, she's not saying that explicitly, but that's the implication of it. Even though I'm a woman, I can understand that text. I might not be able to read the Bible, but I can understand that the Bible tells us to go forth and multiply. Now, some of you may have noticed, and I know some of you did notice, that she never mentions children in the entire prologue. There's no sign either in the description of her in the prologue, the general prologue to the Canterbury Tales, nor in her prologue. Nowhere is there a sign that she's had any children at all. She might have them and not talk about them. You'd think she would talk about them if that's her argument for marriage. But she doesn't mention any. It's just an argument that she's pulling out and saying, look at this Bible passage. This is what God told us to do. And I'm going to get to the topic of glossing in a moment, but this, you might notice this, men may glosen up and doen. That's a little bit more of a complicated line than it even looks. A lot of scholars have noted that there's a little bit of a pun in her job. So she's a cloth maker, she's a textile maker. Latin textus means texture or tissue, as in cloth, but also text or construction or combination of language. It's a very frequent medieval pun, the sort of textile pun. And it seems pretty clear that Chaucer is playing on this ambiguity. She's someone who can make text. She can weave texts out of previous texts, which makes her not unlike a learned man, actually. So let's look a little bit at glossing, just to give you an image of this. Some of you will probably know already. I think if we were in the room, I would look out at you. But some of you probably know or have seen glossed pages from the Middle Ages. So glossing is a major form of literary and intellectual production in the Middle Ages. You rarely see books that are sort of pristine the way modern books are. People gloss the Bible, classical texts, even medieval ones, which in their eyes would have been modern. They wouldn't have ever used the word medieval. Even a number of Chaucerian manuscripts, so manuscripts of the Canterbury Tales, are glossed in Latin with little explanatory notes or proverbs or things like that on the edges. And it's sort of the essential thing that you do in schools and universities. A lot of what teachers did was explain what the text meant in the way what we do today a lot of the time as well, bit by bit. And they might be working from a gloss text, and in situations where students were able to afford books, they might also gloss their own texts. There are different kinds of glosses. So, for example, you can have for example, for a Latin text, you might have glosses which just tell you what certain words mean in the vernacular language, whether that's English or German or French. You might have explanatory glosses that just give you an easier Latin word. So if the text has a hard Latin word, maybe it gives you the Latin word in between the lines. There are glosses that are just little pointers that help people interpret the Latin syntax, so hints for how to read the Latin line when it doesn't have the same word order as the vernacular language does. And then, of course, you have commentary, and you have the Bosworth Psalter from the third quarter of the 10th century, sort of Psalms 19 and 20. And here you can see it's got interlinear glosses and it has marginal glosses as well. So you can have various layers of explanation and interpretation. I have another image for you, which is a slightly later manuscript. This is B.L. Harley, MS 1700. It's a manuscript of the Minor Prophets from either the end of the 12th century or the start of the 13th century. So just a couple centuries later than the last manuscript we saw. This is Hosea, so it's also the Bible. And you can see, again, you have the main text in the middle in a kind of clearer, more bolded hand. You have interlinear glosses in between those lines of the biblical text. And then you have quite nicely organized. This is clearly not, just done on the this is not a spontaneous glossing situation. They have the lines all written out on the margins in order to have a lot of interpretation. So you have really just a few words of the text itself and tons of interpretation around it. So this is really a specialized knowledge technology, and it's one in which women generally did not participate unless maybe they were, in a monastery and had access to that kind of education. But this is the world of men. And it's knowledge most people don't have access to because most of it is in Latin. And that means that the person who glosses, the person who interprets this text, which is difficult and in another language, has a great deal of power to interpret it in the direction that they want. And so it's known already in the Middle Ages that glossing usually is explanatory, but could also potentially be spurious or deceitful. So medieval Latin glossare means mostly, to explain, to elucidate, but also to provide a specious explanation or interpretation. So an interpretation which isn't really right, which is kind of a stretch. The way sometimes we also do with literary texts or historical materials or philosophy, it's the interpretation that pushes too far. So this then leads to multiple meanings of the word gloss in Middle English. We'll come back to the Middle English dictionary. This is the word glosen. Has the base meaning, which the word still does today, to explain or comment on a word, paraphrase. But look at number 2. It can also mean to obscure the truth of a matter, to falsify a statement, to gloze over, to falsely represent or disguise. So the sense of glosen as something that can be bringing out the truth of something, but can also be deceitful. And then wonderfully, it also has meaning 3, to use fair words, talk smoothly or courteously, speak with blandishment, flattery, or deceit, to cajole, flatter. So basically, it's glossing is also a form of seduction. It's used that way in Middle English. It's unfortunately lost that meaning in modern English. And basically, what I want to suggest is what the wife of Bath is saying is, 1, that's what glossing is, this world of authority, of textual authority, of educated male clerks, like her fifth husband, Jenkin. That world is smart, but also deceitful and potentially seductive. It can obscure or falsify. They can misinterpret scripture for their own purposes because they have that power of the person who's glossing. However, she's essentially saying she can do it too. And when she says she can do it too, she's implying, I can also gloss. I can also interpret the text of the Bible or other texts, but I can also lie and I can seduce. And I think this is this word. I spent some time on the definitions of this word because it's really, in one way, it's the key to her whole prologue. Hers is a performance in glossing, in explaining, in arguing, in deceiving, in kind of stretching things, and in seducing. And I think you have to, everything that she says, somebody in one of the Übungen says, well, we can't trust anything she says. That's correct. You cannot trust a single thing she says because she's told us we cannot trust it. Everything she says is with a wink. Everything she says is meant to keep us guessing, and it is also a kind of seduction of the audience. She's trying to seduce them in a way by showing how deceitful she is, which is a really interesting move. So I want to show a couple of examples, or at least one or two examples of this. There are a few coming up later. Um, she offers a number of arguments against virginity or for sexual life. So some of them, are quite practical. She says, "Well, look, we're not all meant to be saints, right? It's good for a few select people, but we are not all meant to have this kind of extraordinary ascetic existence. Some people are meant to be virgins, and that's great. Some of us are meant to marry." She makes the children argument, and basically says, I'm paraphrasing here, but she says, well, if no one had sex and no one had children, there wouldn't be any virgins anymore, would there? So somebody has to be having sex in this whole situation for there to be these pure and perfect virgins. They don't just spring out of nothing. She talks at one point about the human body and says, well, why were we given genitals if it wasn't to have sex with? Why was sex made pleasant? Why do we feel pleasure in our genitals if it wasn't so God could make engendrure, engendering, if God, so that God could make that more pleasant. And then she addresses, very good argument. She's a very good debater, as it were. So she basically addresses the counter argument and says, well, I know some people say it's to relieve ourselves, but experience shows that this is not true. It's not the genitals are not just formed that way so that we can go urinate. It's also so that we have pleasure in the act of sex. And so if God made us that way, why should we not use them? And then she has quite a spicy moment where she talks about Jesus's body and how Jesus was shapen as a man, so shapen as a man. But okay, he was a special kind of man. We don't expect him to use his genitals, but I, the wife of Bath, will. So she goes through all of these arguments about the human body, about sexuality. But then, in a sense, she also has a few arguments which more try to show the value of things that are not considered perfect by society. So I'll read this passage out loud, which I think is a good example of this. Inil envia no virginity, lad ham be bread of pured huetesed, and latus vives hoten barley bread. And yet with barley bread, Mark Telecan, ur Lord Jesu refreshed mania man. In such a stat as God hath cleped us, I will persevere, I nam not precious. So she says basically, I don't envy virginity. I know they're the white bread, and in the Middle Ages, white bread is finer, more expensive, more, it's what the upper class or the gentility would eat. Let them be the white bread, the fancy white bread, and let us married women be called barley bread. So kind of lower, more rustic, more rough. And then she refers to a passage in John where Jesus feeds a mass of people with 5 loaves of barley bread and 2 fish. And it is indeed barley bread. I always check because I think, is it really barley bread? It's barley bread. And yet with barley bread, Jesus refreshed many a man. Jesus fed all of these people with barley bread, not with fancy white bread, but with barley bread. So I love this passage because I find it really funny that in the Middle Ages, white bread was more expensive and fancier, and barley bread was sort of the rough and cheap bread you could eat. And now it's flipped completely, and we know that white bread isn't very good for you. So you pay more for the sort of expensive bio whole grain barley bread. So in a way, she was right. She knew her way around bread quality. But I also find it funny because she has a little bit of a play there. She talks about how Ur Lord Jesu refreshed mani a man. And when she says refreshed in the context of the prologue or in Chaucer's work more generally, that also has a sexual double meaning. Um, Fresh, her fifth husband Jenkin is fresh abed. That's one of the things she loves about him, is that he's fresh in bed, which means he's virile, he's exciting, he's fun to have sex with. And she talks about King Solomon refreshed with all of his wives. It's very clearly a word with strong sexual connotations. And what is she saying, actually? She's, in a sense, saying, Lord, so the Lord Jesus refreshed many a man with barley bread. The implication is that Jesus will use her to refresh lots of men. So again, another one of her jokes was basically saying, look, I'm meant to be shared around. I'm like the barley bread in that miracle. I can feed more than one person, right? Or I can feed more than one appetite. I can satisfy lots of people. And that's a theme in the prologue as well, to the sense of unquenchable sexual availability. She also describes herself as a lamp or a flame that lots of people can light their wicks on, right? But I do think there's also a bigger philosophical point underneath this, underneath the sort of the tongue-in-cheek, seductive, playful reference to her own sexuality. She's making a point, which is that there are different kinds of people in the world. And yes, society has decided that virgins are the ones who are most valuable and most perfect and most ideal. But other people are useful too. That doesn't mean, other people aren't worth anything or don't have their own function to play in life. So I want to take you now back a little bit to earlier in the 14th century, to a text which it seems pretty clear Chaucer knew, although there's not a ton of scholarship on this. This is one of the texts that is less discussed, and partly because there weren't good editions and translations for a long time, or certainly not into English. It's now been edited and translated into really good, accessible translation. It's one of Dante's stranger works. It's called the Convivio. This is the same Dante who wrote the Divine Comedy and the Vita Nuova, which Chaucer is definitely reading. But this particular work is a philosophical treatise. Dante wrote it around 1304 to 1307, shortly after he was exiled from Florence. And it's kind of wild in its setup. It's 4 long books of philosophical commentary, but to his own poems. So Dante being Dante, he has these poems which he's written, and then he writes a commentary to them, kind of glossing, right, in the way of making himself into the autorité in 2 ways, right, on both the text that's being commented and the commentator. One of the themes of this book is the nature of nobility, which appears as gentilezza or nobilitade in Dante's Italian. And in Dante's context, that could refer to dignity, fame, wealth, good birth, or inner virtue. So just as today we might talk about nobility referring to someone's status by birth versus nobility of character, of morals, in Dante's time, this idea is also a broader idea. It's no longer just birth. It has a number of different meanings. So again, dignity, fame, wealth, good birth, or inner virtue. And, it's a text which is, it's a concept which is already problematic, because some people will insist they have nobility because of who they were born to, because of who their parents are. And other people would say, no, it doesn't count. It doesn't matter if your father is a count or a duke or the king. It's all irrelevant. The question is who you are, how you behave. Put a pin in that, because we are going to come back to this question next week when we look at The Wife of Bath's Tale, which is very much concerned with this question of what is true gentilezza, what is true gentility. Dante insists that nobility is inner virtue. It's not based on who you're from. Or what family you belong to. It's who you are, how you have been educated, and how you have worked on yourself, essentially. And he is, in his thinking, he's basing his ideas on Aristotle. And Aristotle has an idea of perfection as completeness. Actually, etymologically, the word perfect literally just means complete. That's why we have the perfect tense. That's an action that's completed already, that took place in the past and it's done. So you have, as today, but also in the Middle Ages, there are two different understandings of perfection. One idea of perfection is flawlessness, immaculateness. The Virgin is perfect in the sense that there's no sin, there's no stain on the virginal body and soul. But then there is this sort of other strain, which I think is less powerful, but it's there in philosophical writing, and it's coming all the way down from Aristotle and through all of, I think it's in Aquinas as well, which says perfection is just being the best version of what you are. So here is Dante really channeling Aristotle. I say then that in terms of our common usage, the word nobility refers to the perfection in each thing of its proper nature. I think actually he's quoting Aristotle there. So it is predicated not only of human beings, but of all things as well. For human beings call a stone noble, a plant noble, a horse noble, a falcon noble, and similarly with regard to each thing which is viewed perfected in its nature. So what's the idea here? And I think it's, if you take something away from this class other than the importance of knowing how to gloss, I would say this is really, you could take this for your life. It's a useful way of thinking about things. It's saying perfection is not one standard that is applied to absolutely everything, no matter what they are or who they are. If you're a shoemaker, your potential perfection lies in making the best shoes possible. So when you talk about perfection for a shoemaker, cobbler, I guess would be the English word. If you're a cobbler, your job is not to be a perfect sailor or a perfect farmer or a perfect ruler or a perfect physician. If you're a cobbler, you just have to perfect the thing that you do, which is making and repairing shoes. That's what you perfect. If you look at a horse doesn't have to be a good rabbit. It doesn't have to be a good chicken. It has to be a good horse, right? Its nature is to be a horse, and you are only judging it according to how well it fulfills its nature. Is it a fast and a strong horse or not, right? It would be irrelevant to ask if it lays good eggs. And that then, in Dante and in Aristotle already, right, implies that human beings are also to be judged according to how well they perfect what they are. They're virtuous if they do the best version of themselves, not if they aspire to some other kind of being. So if you're a woman, it doesn't make sense to aspire to the same. I mean, in the Middle Ages, these are strong categories, so there are certain ways to overcome them, right? So female virgins are often thought to be spiritually like men, right? It's a way of escaping the weakness of your gender, if you like. Because you leave lust behind, and women are supposed to be lusty. But if you're a woman, according to this Aristotelian, Dantean way of thinking, you don't have to try to be like a man. You could just be a good woman. And also that doesn't make sense. Are you a nun? Are you a wife? Do you brew beer? Are you a brewer of beer? Are you a textile maker? You just have to do the best version of that. So here is Dante again. Each thing is consummately perfect when it reaches and attains its own proper virtue. And then it is consummately in agreement with its own nature. The circle can be called perfect when it is truly a circle. So this is very much not perfection as flawlessness. A circle doesn't need to try to be a perfect square. It just has to be a perfect circle. So perfection is something that is specific to each creature or object and refers to how fully they embody what they already are, their own nature. And that also suggests that perfection is an active process. So if you think of perfection as something that's flawlessness, you can only fall from that perfection. It's a very static kind of perfection. You have to protect it all the time. You have to make sure you don't feel any lust or accidentally hold hands with someone, or have dirty thoughts at some point, because then it's over. You're no longer perfect. That perfection is purity and flawlessness can only ever be destroyed. It cannot be improved. You start perfect and then you go down. The kind of perfection we see here described in Dante from the Greek tradition is an active process. It's something that you work towards. It involves growth over time, it involves self-knowledge, and it involves experience, obviously. And I think, I would argue that Chaucer has been reading the Convivio. I'm not the first person to say that, but I think usually people talk about the Convivio as influencing the tale, which you'll read next week. I would argue that the Convivio has also influenced the portrait of the wife of Bath and how she presents herself. Her larger point is that it's not that she's imperfect, but she's in the process of perfecting who she is. Two more slides before we close. Here's another one of her arguments. Of mine stat in il not maken no boast, for well ye kno, a lord in his household had not every vessel all of gold. Some been of tree, and don her lord service. God clepeth folk to him in sundry ways, and everych hath of God a proper gift. So she says, look, I'm not boasting about who I am, but you know that even someone really wealthy doesn't have every dish made of gold in their household. They also have wooden plates and servers and trenchers and so on. And those also work to eat off of. Like, you can eat off of those just fine. And then there's this line which is really very biblical, which is to say, God calls people to him in various ways, and each person has their own gift from God. So she's drawing on Dante and Aristotle through Dante, but she's also, I say she, I obviously mean Chaucer speaking through the wife of Bath. She's also drawing on the Bible and again glossing the Bible and saying, look, if we each have our own gift from God, we're all called to serve God in different ways. It's not clear to me how much she serves God at all, but never mind that. Her argument is we're all called to serve God in different ways. We all have our own gifts from God. We don't all have to be the same. We can all serve. You can eat just as well off of a piece of wood as you can off of a piece of gold. And frankly, and that's also a biblical line, this idea of the vessels of gold and wood. And so this is her argument against perfectionism. I want to look at the very end on a passage which you will see is a little bit of a disputed passage. And I do want to quote it for you because it makes my point so well. Why is it disputed? Some of the manuscripts don't have it. Some of them do. So the question is it an interpolation or is it a few lines with Chaucer later added? And that's up for debate. So some editions will just show these lines in the text of the prologue, of the Wife of Bath's prologue. Sometimes they'll have a little square brackets around them to show you that they're disputed. I think in our text they're in the footnote. Our editor has decided to sort of have these lines in the footnote. But I'll show you the lines, which I do think do sound a lot like Chaucer to me. Diverse skoles maken parfit klerks, and diverse praktik en mani sondre werkes maketh the workman parfit secretly. Of five husbondes skoling am I, welcome the sixth, whenever he shall. So diverse schools make perfect clerks, right? You go to one school, you go to Bologna for the law, you go to Cologne or to Paris for something else. And if you workmen who practice in different works and different kinds of craft become perfect in those crafts. This is Aristotle, this is Dante, right? I am going to school. I am schooling myself in 5 husbands. So she's basically saying, I am becoming perfect at being a wife. Okay, again, I hope you will be thinking she doesn't sound like a very perfect wife. She does seem to have, or it's not really clear that she's improving necessarily. The story she tells about her own life is a lot more complex than what she says in this introductory section, arguing for marriage. Maybe with the final one, they seem to have reached some kind of better status quo. But then she says, and this part is in all the texts, not just in this last line is not disputed. Welcome the sixth whenever he shall. Welcome the sixth whenever he shall. So she's now speaking to the pilgrims and saying, I'm getting really good at this marriage thing. I'm becoming quite perfect. This is my craft, actually, although she has a craft. This is my craft, and I'm working on perfecting it. I'm getting good at having husbands. So welcome to the sixth husband whenever it's time for him. And maybe that sixth husband is one of the pilgrims in her audience. And in that way, you might read the entire prologue as a form of glosing, a kind of explanation, argument, and seduction. Thank you all.